In 1962, the US government approved a plan to kill its own citizens and blame another country for it. This is not a theory. It's a declassified document signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But that's just one of 7 operations we're covering today. Operations so disturbing that they were deliberately hidden for decades. Operations your history teacher will never mention. They conducted mind control experiments on unwitting Americans. They controlled the news you read. They flooded cities with drugs to fund illegal wars. By the end of this video, you'll see how far your government was willing to go, and you'll never look at American history the same way again. Let's start with the operation that sounds like science fiction but was terrifyingly real. Operation 1, MKUltra, the mind control program in 1953. The CIA launched what would become one of the most disturbing programs in American history. The goal? To develop techniques for mind control and interrogation that could turn ordinary people into programmable agents. MKUltra wasn't just one experiment. It was an umbrella program that funded over 150 subprojects at 80 institutions, including 44 universities and 12 hospitals. They recruited doctors, scientists, and researchers who believed they were serving their country. What they were actually doing was torturing American citizens. The experiments were horrific. Subjects were given LSD without their knowledge or consent. They were subjected to sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and sexual abuse, and various forms of psychological torture. Some were kept in drug-induced comas for weeks. Others had their memories erased through electroshock therapy. But here's what makes it even more sinister. Most of the subjects had no idea they were part of an experiment. The CIA recruited prisoners who couldn't refuse. They targeted vulnerable populations like sex workers and drug addicts, knowing nobody would believe them if they spoke out. They even experimented on their own agents and military personnel without telling them. One victim was a scientist named Frank Olson. In 1953, his CIA colleagues secretly dosed his drink with LSD during a work retreat. 9 days later, Olson fell to his death from a 13th floor hotel window in New York City. For 22 years, his family was told it was suicide. The truth was far darker. Let that sink in for a moment. A government scientist, drugged without consent, falls from a window. His family lied to for 22 years. And this wasn't a conspiracy theory. In 1975, Congressional hearings confirmed everything. Declassified documents, testimonies from CIA officers, medical records, the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. The program ran for 20 years before being officially halted in 1973. But here's the truly terrifying part. When Congress began investigating in 1995, CIA Director Richard Helms had already ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. Most of what we know today comes from the few documents that survived by accident. We'll never know the full extent of the damage. We'll never know how many lives were destroyed. And we'll never know if similar programs are still running today under different names. Which brings us to Operation Number 2, an operation that changed how Americans consume their news forever. Operation 2, Operation Mockingbird. Controlling the media while MKUltra was controlling minds directly. Operation Mockingbird was controlling minds on a much larger scale. This was the CIA's systematic program to manipulate American media and public opinion. Starting in the early 1950s, the CIA began recruiting journalists, editors, and media executives as assets. These weren't foreign agents or spies in the traditional sense. These were respected American journalists working for the most trusted names in news. At its height, the CIA had relationships with over 400 journalists and 25 major news organizations. We're talking about the New York Times, CBS, ABC, Newsweek, Time Magazine, and the Washington Post. The very institutions Americans trusted to tell them the truth were secretly working with the intelligence community. How did it work? The CIA would plant stories in foreign newspapers, knowing American media would pick them up and republish them as legitimate news. They would provide journalists with classified information to publish, creating stories that served the agency's interests. They would even pay journalists to write specific articles or kill stories that were damaging to CIA operations. But it wasn't just about planting positive stories. It was about suppressing negative ones. When investigative journalists got too close to exposing CIA operations, Mockingbird assets would intervene. Stories would be edited, delayed, or completely spiked. The most shocking revelation came in 1977 during congressional hearings. CIA Director William Colby admitted that the agency had used journalists as intelligence assets, but the scope of the operation was so vast that we still don't know all the details. Think about that for a moment. During the Cold War, during Vietnam, during Watergate, Americans were reading news that was shaped, edited, and sometimes completely fabricated by the CIA. The free press you were taught to trust wasn't so free after all. And here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask. If it happened then, what makes you think it's not happening now? In an age of digital media, social platforms, and 24-hour news cycles, wouldn't it be easier than ever to shape public opinion? But if you think controlling the news is shocking, wait until you hear the full details of that operation I mentioned at the beginning. The one where your government planned to kill its own citizens. This next operation is so disturbing that even when it was declassified, most people couldn't believe it was real. Operation 3. Operation Northwoods, the false flag blueprint in 1962. The Pentagon drafted a plan so unthinkable that when it was finally declassified in 2000, it shocked even the most cynical historians. Operation Northwoods was a proposed false flag operation where the U.S. government would stage terrorist attacks against its own citizens to justify invading Cuba. This wasn't some rogue agent's crazy idea. This was an official proposal signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemnitzer, and presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The plan was detailed and methodical. They proposed hijacking commercial airliners and blaming Cuba. They suggested sinking boats filled with Cuban refugees and claiming Castro did it. They even discussed staging violent terrorist campaigns in American cities, bombing U.S. ships, and creating casualties among American military personnel. One proposed scenario was particularly disturbing. They would create a fake group of Cuban agents and have them attack the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Another involved staging funerals for mock victims of Cuban aggression to generate public sympathy. The goal was simple: create enough outrage and fear among the American public to justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Manufactured the consent of the people through deception and violence against their own citizens. President Kennedy rejected the plan, calling it unthinkable. But the fact that senior military officials seriously proposed it tells you something terrifying about how far the government was willing to go. It wasn't rejected because it was impossible or because nobody had the stomach for it. It was rejected because one man said no. Think about that. Your own government, planning to murder you, to justify a war. And this was on paper, official signed. What if Kennedy had said yes? What if he had been more hawkish? American history would have been written with the blood of innocent civilians, all to justify a war based on lies. And here's what should keep you up at night. If they were willing to plan this in 1962, what plans might exist today that we won't know about for another 60 years? Operation for Iran-Contra drugs, guns, and cover-ups in the 1980s. The CIA orchestrated one of the most complex and illegal operations in American history. They sold weapons to Iran, a hostile nation under an arms embargo, to fund right-wing rebels in Nicaragua, despite Congress explicitly forbidding it. But it gets worse. To fund their illegal war, the CIA facilitated drug trafficking into American cities. Nicaraguan Contra rebels were smuggling cocaine into the United States with CIA knowledge and protection. The drugs flooded into Los Angeles and other major cities, fueling the crack epidemic that devastated Black and Latino communities throughout the 1980s. When investigative journalist Gary Webb exposed these connections in his Dark Alliance series, he was vilified by the mainstream media. His career was destroyed, and he died under suspicious circumstances in 2004 from 2 gunshot wounds to the head, officially ruled a suicide. Pause for a second. The same agency destroying communities with crack was the same one that claimed to protect American interests. The irony is sickening. Decades later, CIA Inspector General Frederick Hitz confirmed that the agency had indeed worked with drug traffickers and failed to investigate or report their activities. The very communities destroyed by crack cocaine were sacrificed to fund an illegal war. Senior officials, including Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, were convicted of crimes related to the scandal, but most convictions were overturned. And President George H.W. Bush pardoned several key figures before they could testify further. The message was clear: break the law in the name of national security, and you'll be protected. Expose those crimes, and you'll be destroyed. And if you think drugs in American cities sounds bad, wait until you hear what they did in Vietnam. This next operation was so brutal that even military officers called it state-sponsored terrorism. Operation 5. Operation Phoenix, assassination and torture in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The CIA ran a program so brutal that even military officers called it a terrorist operation. Operation Phoenix was designed to neutralize Viet Cong infrastructure through capture, interrogation, and assassination. Between 1967 and 1972, the program killed over 26,000 Vietnamese civilians. But the official number is likely much lower than the reality. Many victims were tortured before being killed, subjected to techniques like waterboarding, electric shock, and chemical injections. The problem was identification. How do you tell a Viet Cong sympathizer from an innocent farmer? Often, you can't. So the program relied on informants who had their own scores to settle. Political rivals, business competitors, and personal enemies were often labeled as Viet Cong and eliminated. 26,000 dead. Most of them civilians, most of them innocent, all in the name of fighting an ideology. CIA Director William Colby, who helped run the program, later admitted it was counterproductive. For every Viet Cong operative killed, 10 more were created as families and villages turned against the American presence. But the operations get even darker. What comes next will show you that everything we've covered so far was just preparation for something even more sinister. Operation 6. Project Artichoke Brainwashing in Biological Warfare before MKUltra. There was Artichoke, launched in 1951. This program was even more sinister. While MKUltra focused on mind control, Artichoke was about creating weapons out of human beings. The goal was to determine whether a person could be involuntarily made to perform an act of attempted assassination. They wanted to create Manchurian candidates, programmed assassins who wouldn't even know they'd been manipulated. The experiments were horrifying. Subjects were given combinations of drugs, including heroin and morphine, then interrogated under hypnosis. They tested whether memories could be erased and new ones implanted. They experimented with sensory deprivation and biological agents. One declassified memo asked a chilling question: can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against fundamental laws of nature such as self-preservation? The answer, according to their research, was yes, under certain conditions. Artichoke evolved into MKUltra, but many Artichoke files were destroyed even before the MKUltra purge. We know it existed, we know it was operational, but the full scope of what they accomplished or attempted may never be known. What we do know is that both programs violated every ethical standard of human experimentation. They violated the Nuremberg Code that America helped establish after World War II. The very principles we used to condemn Nazi medical experiments were being ignored by our own government. Let that sink in. The same country that prosecuted Nazi doctors was doing the exact same thing in secret. Operation 7, Operation Gladio. Stay behind armies and false flag terror. Our final operation takes us to Europe, where the CIA orchestrated one of the longest-running covert operations in history. Operation Gladio was a stay-behind network of armed operatives designed to resist Soviet invasion if Western Europe fell during the Cold War, but Gladio became something far more sinister. In Italy, Greece, Turkey, and other NATO countries, these networks were linked to terrorist attacks, assassinations, and political manipulation. The strategy was called the strategy of tension. Right-wing operatives would carry out terrorist attacks and blame them on left-wing groups or communists. The goal was to create fear and push the public toward supporting authoritarian governments and right-wing policies. In Italy alone, Gladio-linked operatives were connected to bombings that killed hundreds of civilians. The most infamous was the 1980 Bologna train station bombing that killed 85 people. For years, left-wing groups were blamed. Decades later, the truth emerged. It was a false flag operation carried out by right-wing extremists with connections to Italian intelligence and NATO structures. When Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti finally revealed Gladio's existence in 1990, it sparked investigations across Europe. Country after country discovered they had similar networks operating in secret. The European Parliament condemned Gladio in 1990, calling it incompatible with democratic principles. But by then, the damage was done. Innocent people had been killed, political movements had been destroyed, and entire countries had been manipulated for decades. And here's the scariest part. Gladio was only shut down after it was exposed. How many similar operations continue today, simply because nobody has discovered them yet? The uncomfortable truth, so there you have it. 7 CIA operations that prove the government you learned about in school is very different from the government that actually exists. These aren't ancient history. These operations happened within living memory. Some of the people who authorized them are still alive. Some of the victims are still seeking justice. And these are just the operations we know about. These are the files that survived destruction. The witnesses who came forward, the journalists who risked everything to expose the truth. How many operations are still classified? How many documents have been destroyed? How many witnesses have been silenced? The pattern is clear. When national security is invoked, ethics disappear. When power is unchecked, abuse is inevitable. And when secrecy is absolute, accountability becomes impossible. Your schools didn't teach you this because it's uncomfortable. It contradicts the narrative of American citizenship. It raises questions about trust, democracy, and the nature of power itself. But uncomfortable truths are still truths. And in a democracy, citizens have a right to know what their government does in their name. So what do you do with this information? You could ignore it, pretend you never watched this video, and go back to the comfortable lies. Or you could accept that the world is more complex and more dangerous than you were taught. You could start questioning official narratives. You could demand transparency and accountability. If this video made you question what you were taught, subscribe. We're just getting started. Drop a comment telling me which operation shocked you most. Share this with someone who still believes everything they learned in school. Because here's the truth they don't want you to remember. History isn't written by the winners. It's written by those who control what you're allowed to know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.